Okay, so Chase and Hunter have been studying Bataille and have an interest in him. And so Chase suggested that this article would be a good introduction to at least, a few of his major ideas. And I have not ever read anything by Bataille. So I'm going to defer to them. In general, I thought, let's see, there had a couple of comments I wanted to make. Oh, one, and maybe, maybe this is not the purpose of this chapter, so maybe my question would be answered if I read other stuff. But one thing I'm just curious is, why is he focusing so much on this notion of expenditure? Or maybe I guess I could say, is he proposing something? Is he proposing that there needs to be a shift in economics or a shift in social policy or something of that sort? And one reason that's a question is because he actually does cites negative, I don't know if I want to say negative consequences, but negative aspects of this notion of expenditure, both in the mode of, he, toward the end, he talks about this giving, this sort of just giving things away, and then also destroying things seem to be the two modes of that, what you do with that excess. But both of them are motivated, it seemed to me, by power. So the giving, the purpose of that was to shame your opponents. And then the purpose of the destruction was to show your opponents how wealthy you are. I'm so wealthy, I can destroy all this shit. And so it still seems to be focused on ways of exerting power over competitors, which, maybe I had read somewhere, and maybe in that review that I sent out, that overview, that he was influenced by Nietzsche. So maybe that's some of the Nietzschean things coming out. But he admits I don't know if admits the right word, that there are sort of destructive aspects to focusing on expenditure. And so all that kind of stuff confuses me as to, he seems to think that there's problems with the contemporary economic capitalist sort of way of dealing with these issues. But then this notion of expenditure has some, at least to me, seems troubling aspects. Maybe he thinks I'm mischaracterizing it, but those are some of my questions.
I'll go on, Hunter. Okay. One initial thought that occurred to me while reading this was a criticism of our modern bourgeoisie as opposed to ages in the past. And when you talk about expenditure as this negative force, either destroying or that second thing, I think in history we see how with the Romans they put on these games to entertain the masses, and it is expenditure. You're spending all this money to say to the population of Rome, don't riot, have fun stuff. And even in Christianity, although on his section on Christianity, he says this is where the trend started towards an atomized almost view of economics, right? And you have the Medicis, right, who funded these great public projects. And what we see contemporarily is that our bourgeoisie, like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, their projects in their own time are hurtful almost, right? Like that trope of rich people owning yachts. A lot do, and they're just filling the seas with ships and taking a lot of energy. Or Jeff Bezos, there's, rocket flight that he took, and thinking about what that money could have been used for and the adverse ecological effects there. And so what we see is how they're using their wealth and how they could be using their wealth. But I don't think he's necessarily advocating for, let's make our rich, CEOs productive and fund, art projects. So I think his last section on class struggle is the grain, and we could possibly have an expenditure which is positive, even if it is by destruction and sacrifice. Those were my thoughts.
Yeah, I think the question, why is he focused on expenditure? Is he proposing something new? I want to try and just be as brief as possible and say, I think that he's just trying to point out he's trying to do some descriptive work on what he sees as a pattern within the notion of expenditure, as it is a necessary and not necessarily recognized, at least enough in his eyes, aspect of things like our concept of utility, usefulness, ends rather than means, efforts towards something, struggles of sacrifice, and we face circumstances like that all the time. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about the whole Christianity thing for a while, because I thought that was awesome. I thought it was really cool, but I'm not going to. Instead, I just want to say that, yeah, I think that he is just kind of describing this, trying to kind of further our understanding of this existing process of expenditure that happens, and it has happened, and it will probably continue to happen. And then the closest that he gets to prescription at any point, I forget the exact section, but he makes a point where he says something along the lines of human life is not and cannot be thought of as a closed system, and we are kind of constantly engaged in this spirit of excitation and expenditure, giving rise to glory and struggle and a measureless hatred that divides men. I thought that was so cool. I thought that was awesome. Talking about a measureless hatred, that's so sick. Nobody talks about hatred. I feel like nobody ever talks about hatred. Everybody's always about, oh, love. Love is the most powerful. No, I hate you. How often does a smart guy ever straight up like, I hate that guy. I don't care. I freaking do not like that. So I just thought that was interesting. But the point is, he says, again, I have trouble finding it, but that we have limiting factors that affect our ability to operate outside of the bounds of this bourgeois economized structure of thought and expenditure that we are existing within. And in fact, it's not really even, to him, it's not even really like we've all been brainwashed and we're too far gone or whatever. It's just that there is at least this is the way it seems to me. I don't know if any of this is accurate, but it seems to me like he's saying that there is this mode of operation for the self-reproduction of capital that distinguishes it, because capital is the distinguishing factor of modern commerce, right? As opposed to pre-modern, non-capitalistic commerce, right? Which Marx would call primitive accumulation and things like that. The first signs of the amassing of wealth. You know what I mean? Which a lot of people have different theories as to what he means by primitive accumulation. But my point is that yes, we do this expenditure thing, and yes, it necessitates this excess and so on, and yes, we can understand it in this discursive way to the best of our abilities. But right now, we're still caught in this set of circumstances where yes, it might seem like he was talking about simplicity. I remember that was the point he was making. He was talking about simplicity, and he said a lot of the time we defer to a simple understanding of what's going on, a slightly simpler understanding of what's going on, or of an idea, or of ourselves, or of a situation, because we are facing necessary, limiting, simplifying factors, and we are obligated to simplify often, and that's a form of expenditure. And he's saying, like, just because we have these limiting factors, this is kind of where I see him kind of joining up with like a Zizekian sort of analysis slightly, just for a moment, where he says, like, yes, we may be kind of caught in this system of expenditure, but none of this in any way necessitates the eternal self-continuation of these circumstances in the way that they're continuing. And yes, power is a part of it. But I guess the last two things I want to say is that, like, the structure of power, I think that's a big point of his, is like we don't have to always be under the boot. It's not impossible for us to imagine a set of circumstances where we are no longer under the weight of the social power of the present actors, nor that the future actors in the position of power should act in any way that is similar, or maybe not in any way similar, but in a particularly similar, characteristically similar or parallel fashion to the present, actors of power. So he's saying like a better world is possible to imagine. We have to admit that, and we can't just put our hands in our pockets and say, well, it's a law. And I think he's willing to say like, yes, it's in this space of where I think Zizek is willing to call it like a lost cause. This is just in response to Nevitt, your thought about like, what should we do? Like, what does it seem? To me, it seems like Bataille is saying what we should do is understand this. This is the second point I wanted to make, that it's not necessarily all just power, and we're all just trying, because if we think of things in just terms of, not just in terms of power, but with power as the principal motivator of action or existence, to me, what that means to me is that I use my power to gain further power. I have a means by which to accomplish an end. And that end is succinctly, restrictedly, perfectly accomplished by the means that I employ. Or maybe not necessarily, but that I employ means continuously in the struggle for some end. And I'm constantly exerting myself in order to acquire, in order to accumulate and to amass and to acquire this power. But I think that he's trying to make this really weird, bold claim here. This is the boldest claim that he's making, which is the strain of the whole paper, I think, is that it's not just, he co-founded a secret cult of Dionysus worship. I didn't know that. That's kind of awesome. But it's not just power. It is power, yes, and power operates in this complex way that's doing this, and it's very Nietzschean. I think you're very right. It's very Nietzschean. But I think he's saying like it's not just a set of terms about power that we can use to fully understand what's going on. Because in order to more holistically understand kind of what's going on and what's motivating people and what's driving these commercial interactions in our social sphere, we have to take in the possibility that people don't need to acquire or want to acquire. They want to lose. They want to lose and to destroy, and they want catastrophe in this really weird way. That's I guess, and that is just a kind of introductory remark, I guess.
Do you notice he actually referenced a very early anthropologist, I believe his name is pronounced Mauss, M-A-U-S-S, in the Potlatch. Chase, this was written roughly in the late 1920s. And so what I was getting out of it was that he was trying to be very broad in his statements about the human past and how elites would function. So he was going out of the Western tradition and, the Potlatch in Northwest North America. You can look at Eric Wolf published an incredibly foundational article in 1957 on closed corporate communities in Mesoamerica and Java. And there's a whole set of religious offices from the merging of Christianity and traditional Native American religion in so many Native American villages throughout Mexico and Guatemala, so that you actually go into debt. If you do it right, you go into debt halfway through the ritual calendar year, right? And then it takes you a while to pay it off because you're paying for the priests, you're paying for processions, you're paying for food and drink, and you enhance your position in the community by giving away your wealth instead of hoarding it. And I thought his main point was, if you look at so much of human history, both in the West and outside of it, that what's happening now meaning roughly the 1920s, is the elite don't care about that. If they spend, and remember Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class, right, with his idea of conspicuous consumption. But it wasn't consumption to help and to give out to the broader community. It was And look how classic the name is. One of the richest people in the United States built a mansion, and it was literally called Biltmore. All right. And that was almost like a pun. Look at how large my house is. I just built this larger than the previous huge mansion that some other asshole just built. And so I thought he was saying something very interesting about what's happening in the 1920s with the economic elite, and that they are literally doing something unprecedented in human history, and they're spending all of this money to identify themselves as the elite, but they're not, like so many cultures did, the ancient Roman, the Northwest Native Americans, the Mesoamericans, they're not giving it out to the community at all.
You know, that was one of my reasons it seemed to me that this was linked with power, because at least when he was talking about Potlatch and even the bourgeois and their expenditures for the so-called, for the sake of the proletariat, that they were not based on compassion. They were not based on trying to help the others explicitly. They were ostentatious displays of wealth. And I mean, he explicitly says that in some of these cultures, the whole purpose of this ostentatious display was to shame other competitors for power within the social structure. So my ability to give, just give all this stuff is an indication of my personal power, that I can sustain this loss either through giving away. And then remember, because he says then it starts this cycle where then the people he gives that I give to, they now feel shame. And so then they have to give in order to overcome that shame. And so it starts this cycle. But the purpose of the giving is not to benefit the society. The purpose of the giving is to establish one's place in the social hierarchy more effectively. And then the ostentatious destruction of wealth was for the same purpose. Look, I am so wealthy that I can just kill all these animals and take the loss and I'm good. And then with regard to the bourgeois, it seemed like part of what he was saying there was that, I guess because we live in sort of a moralized age, they want to look like they're taking care of the people, but really what they're doing is they're giving them bread and circuses. They're trying to keep them, sated so that they don't, so they can let the wealthy go on and do their thing. And so that's what I say, there seems to be, I don't see much in here. And, one thing I have to be careful of is a lot of times when Nietzsche is describing what he thinks was happening in ancient civilizations, he was not necessarily endorsing it or endorsing all of it. He was doing, kind of like Hunter was saying, a descriptive thing and saying, this is the way societies have been organized in the past. We ought to at least ask the question, is it better now? Were there elements that we lost that we should have retained? He's not necessarily endorsing the whole thing. So I want to be careful about claiming that, I'm not going to say Bataille thinks that all of that use of expenditure for the purpose of accumulating and exhibiting power is necessarily what we should be doing. But at least that's the sense I got. I mean, it seemed to me it was mostly about self-aggrandizement, about establishing one's role in the power structure of the society, doing that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right on track there, Nevitt. And it's not only with how do you pronounce this man's name?
Bataille.
Bataille.
Thank you, Bataille. But also anthropologists will be the first to admit that, yeah, I mean, this is a form of going up the food chain, being part of your community's elite. And it is the expenditure of funds. And so you will be at the very, very top. But what's interesting, though, is even though it is still one-upmanship, what is the form that one-upmanship takes? You know what I'm trying to say? I mean, even if it is elite-driven, it does seem to help to sustain those communities because there is for whatever selfish elite reasons, there is a redistribution of resources down throughout the entire community. more like a safety valve, and that rather than the piling up, right, back, the prototypical, the of bags of money, right, hoarding for hoarding's sake. Look at all this money I have, which seems to be, when you look at the very rich in the United States today and the percentage of what they give, it is much, much less than, say, comparatively speaking, 100 years ago, as a percentage of their total wealth. And anyway, so I the reason why I wanted to mention that, Nevid, is because he seemed to be comparing what was then his now to what his reading of how society's elites had been distributing in the past. But maybe I'm misreading it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. Especially, I think one of the main things he's trying to distinguish or claim is he's trying to challenge this notion that the economy is mainly a problem of accumulation and production, and that social status is about just simply quantities of accumulation, rather than, okay, if a society is structured by its ostentatious displays of expenditure, that's going to be a kind of built-in way of limiting private accumulation. So I think that's really important. But another thing that I think is definitely distinguished from the kind of individualistic kind of power games that he's pointing out is that I think that dimension is definitely there, that Nevid pointed out, but the way that society is structured, it makes it where it's invested more publicly. So I think one example is that you had even something like a king or a monarchy, whatever, and during the medieval ages, it was still expected that there would be something going back towards the church in some way, towards cathedrals, so that private wealth was still being expected to have this aspect of charity kind of just automatically involved with it. But then when values are instead, no, just simply have private accumulation, it's not necessary to have any kind of public investment or anything like that. That's what I think he's pointing at as a pretty major difference between those two.
But this is kind of like my comment about charity, though. But if he's going to distinguish expenditure from utility, does that mean that anytime an expenditure is useful, it's not actually expenditure? And so if I give my money away for the purpose of helping the poor or doing something like that, I'm still focused on utility. I'm trying to be useful to the society. I'm trying to be useful to people. Whereas it seems his notion of expenditure is explicitly non-utilitarian. So, I mean, that's kind of, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I think, say that individual who gives their goats away for sacrifices or food for some kind of festival, something like that, that individual could definitely have some kind of utility involved with it. Although I think the difference would be, what is he actually producing there for the community? It would be something like a festival that doesn't have some kind of straightforward utility. The same way, yeah, I have some kind of party with all this debauchery and whatnot. Somebody could have utility from it, but it would be probably more of a kind of a secondary thing, where there would be this community effect so I think one thing he talks about, and with is kind of like, so he was very influenced by Nietzsche, and particularly this notion, the Dionysian, as a religious phenomena of where what is sacred is something that is found in these group activities where you have, you altered states of consciousness and whatnot that lead towards some kind of a collective group identification, something like that. And he sees that as very important for kind of breaking down these individualistic, egoistic barriers that keep people in that kind of atomized state. Instead, there's some kind of investment of desire in collective forms of association. So that is one of the main effects. There could be, definitely individualistic kind of motives underlying these things, but I think that's the big difference. And that very structure of having it where it's invested in that fashion, that itself leads towards less of these individualistic kind of desires for whatever it is they're trying to do, put up a festival or something like that. So yeah, at least that's the way I kind of understood it. And I think that kind of goes along with the other stuff I've read about his so yeah, he started this a cult basically in the 30s that was basically worshiping Nietzsche's Dionysus. And it was, so he was really into the idea of sacrifice and all this stuff. And basically he voluntarily agreed to be sacrificed, and so did other people in the society, but nobody wanted to be the executioner. So it did not happen. But I think he took it very seriously. And if you read some of their stuff, they have a kind of utopian view almost of a kind of something like a collective society that is, and it's focused on this idea of breaking down these barriers of the ego and whatnot, more so than this individualistic kind of structure of power, that they're trying to get away from that, it seems like, more than anything. So yeah.
I think it might be useful, Nevitt, to regard the first paragraph, right? Every time the meaning of a discussion depends on the fundamental value of the word useful. In other words, every time the essential question touching on the life of human societies is raised, no matter who intervenes and what opinions are expressed, it is possible to affirm that the debate is necessarily warped and that the fundamental question is eluded. And so I think you raised some good points about if potlatch or expenditure can be useful in a utilitarian sense, but perhaps we should review what we're including in this term utilitarian. He makes the division between a thing done for the sake of another thing, right? I do this action to, get something else, like wage labor, right? I don't necessarily want to work in a low-paying job because I love it so much, but rather to get something out of it, namely money, versus something for the sake of itself. And this is difficult to understand, I believe, because it falls into that category of question of, do you really have any selfless actions, right? That whole idea of, oh, yeah, you gave up your spot in line to the old lady, but you profited because you feel better about yourself. So you selfish asshole, go run amok. That's how I'm viewing that sort of disagreement between something done for the sake of another and something done for itself.
So here, this is a sentence from the partial paragraph at the top of 117, which is the second page of the article. On the whole, any general judgment of social activity implies the principle that an individual effort in order to be valid must be reducible to fundamental necessities of production and conservation. And I took that as his basic description of what utilitarian means, that distributing resources for the sake of production or conservation is what constitutes useful. And I don't, to what degree can I associate that with utilitarianism, as in John Stuart Mill, I'm not sure. It seems that it's got to have a high correlation, but production and conservation. And so I took that what that meant was expenditure would explicitly not be aimed at either production or conservation. That expenditure is aimed at things like destruction, waste, superfluous expenditure, because if it's productive, or if it's producing good for the, goods for the society, or if it's conserving goods, then it's not expenditure. And so that's the way I understood, this notion of utility is production and conservation.
So I'm looking at page 122, and I think he's talking about the potlatches, and he mentions usury. And at the bottom of that second paragraph, so the first full paragraph on 122, he says, this comparison applies only to a secondary characteristic of potlatch. And that makes me think, is what he getting at? Like, so the example of getting out of my spot in line, like the primary drive is that loss, whereas like maybe there's a secondary characteristic of production, but we wouldn't necessarily say like that's the driving force of the act. So I'm thinking like, how we can see that while there's like this relative utility in some of those acts, that they're not reducible to utility and only utility, but there's maybe like an accidental secondary utility that comes out of them.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there's any example where it's just pure expenditure, as in how you described it, Nevid, being neither productive nor conserving, because even in the potlatch, right, where you get all of the resources that you've acquired, accumulated, and you destroy them, it gives a sense of community. It's a prestige thing. You get to fight your rivals. And so with anything, yeah, I can't really think of one example where nothing is gained by this. All we did was destroy a thing.
That's clearly not productive or conservative, though, at least in material terms. And I, especially with regard to the notion of utility, I took production and conservation to be specifically in terms of material usefulness for, for increasing standard of living, for providing resources for people, sort of maybe Marxist kind of notions of utility, if you will, things that are useful for the society, for people. And so like destruction of property, you could say it has a social use in the sense of establishing my power, but it's not productive or conservative in any sort of material sense. It's exactly the opposite of that. And then, if I give my wealth away to one of my competitors for power, that is also not productive or conservative in a material sense. In fact, it is a way of disadvantaging my competitor, because now I have exhibited my great power over him by being able to just throw my wealth at him and saying, you can have these 1,000 cows. I don't need them. You need them more than I need them. I mean, that seemed to be the whole tenor of that sort of giving. It wasn't a giving to the society. It wasn't for the sake of building social cohesion. It was for the sake of exhibiting one's power. And I'm reminded of, and I don't know if he's thinking of this, but one of the things that Nietzsche says in the genealogy about the masters is that the masters give. And, if you look, one of Aristotle's, one of the virtues that Aristotle lists in the Nicomachean Ethics is generosity. But the generosity is not really for the sake of helping other people. It does, and maybe this is what you mean, it inadvertently helps other people, so it has an inadvertent utility, but the purpose of it is to exhibit one's great wealth. And, Nietzsche says that the masters, they gave from a sense of overabundance. Like it's just, God, I've got all this stuff. I've just got to distribute some of it. So he says, Nietzsche claimed that it explicitly was not for the sake of helping. It was from this feeling of overabundance of power and wealth and needing to It's like a wild horse who has too much energy and has got to go out to battle or run a race or something. This guy just has too much. And it's like, God, I've just got to get rid of some of this shit.
To add to what everybody's been saying, if y'all look on page 123, it's the last paragraph, almost at the very bottom, fourth line from the bottom. Actually, begging pardon, no, more like sixth or seventh. In so-called civilized societies, the fundamental obligation, which he italicized, of wealth disappeared only in a fairly recent period. And I thought that jumped out at me, right? The fundamental obligation of wealth disappeared in only a fairly recent period. And then if you look at the last paragraph of the next page on 124, the second sentence of the last paragraph, the modern bourgeoisie is characterized by the refusal in principle of this obligation. It has distinguished itself from the aristocracy of the fact that it has consented only to spend for itself and within itself. In other words, by hiding its expenditures as much as possible from the eyes of the other classes. And so, I mean, to me, that seems to be a very, very, for him, the author, it's a very important shift in what people at the very top of the food chain do with their wealth, or expectations of themselves of what they should do with their wealth.
And how's
I
that?
mean,
I saw him relating it to Christianity. I was going to ask, how is that exactly related to Christianity?
I think what he's taught. Well, I don't know how he would say it, but from my point of view, it's basically that's one result of the secularization of society. I mean, there's certainly huge problems that Christianity created for people, and in the name of God and Jesus, terrible things have happened. But when Christianity replaced the Greco-Roman world, I mean, he actually even says this. I think it's on page 122. He says, or maybe it's 123, Christianity replaced pagan expenditure prescribed by custom with voluntary alms. Well, you know, what if you're really not Christian? I mean, what if you're completely secular? And so screw alms. That sounds medieval to me. And I've got mine, screw you, right? I mean, that there's no claim can be made on a religious basis because the person basically has a secular worldview.
I think the connection with Christianity is best seen in the Protestant work ethic. I haven't really seen the connection to maybe Roman Catholicism / early Christianity. It just wasn't a process of Constantine saying, okay, we're Christian now, no more expenditure, guys. You got to give to the monastery. But definitely with the Protestant work ethic, where the idea is you do your work, cultivate your wealth, you die, pass it on to your family. You know, it's very within a system and it doesn't go out. And you don't see these projects of the bourgeoisie like you do in Catholic Italy under the Medicis, like I mentioned earlier, like Il Duomo, you know, big giant dome.
Well, but remember, before the Renaissance and the Medici, you would have had the incredible work of Aquinas, which if you want to look at the social, well, okay, maybe, okay, go. But if you want to look at the modern social encyclicals of the popes from Leo the 13th to John Paul II, that rejects both unregulated capitalism and communism, you have to trace it really back to Aquinas, who really developed the concept of the just price and the just wage. And to say that you simply cannot view human beings, the human person, as a cog or element in an economy, that they have certain foundational rights that predate any government and predate any kind of economic system.
You know, responding to that thing that Ed read, Christianity, and this is the very bottom of 123, individualized property giving its possessor, wait, no, I'm sorry. The sentence, a few sentences before that. In so-called civilized societies, the fundamental obligation of wealth disappeared only in a fairly recent period. But if you look like what he's talking about earlier in the paragraph, that obligation does not have to do with relieving the poor. It has to do with festivals, spectacles, and games. He says, one notes, anyway, he's talking about the obligation of the wealthy to provide these entertainments for the poor, these gladiatorial games and festivals and so on. So there again, that expenditure, that obligation that is lost is not, at least not what he's listing here, is not to help people. It is, they've abrogated their duty to provide bread and circuses to the populace. And then it's not until then, he says, then Christianity shows up and individualizes property, which is something that Chase has been bringing up that I think must be important, and I'm missing the significance of that. I mean, I think it is important. I'm not getting a firm grip on that. But Christianity individualized property, and that's when the expenditures shift to voluntary alms, either in the form of distributions from the rich to the poor, or to churches and later to monasteries. And so the early obligation was not to help the poor, it was to provide bread and circuses. It wasn't until Christianity, at least in this paragraph, shows up that it shifts to that. And I'm guessing because of the moralizing element that comes along with Christianity that Bataille seems less than thrilled with.
I was gonna, throw some points back at Chase. Like, I'm looking at that line on page 119 when he talks about cults and sacrifice, and he says sacrifice is nothing other than the production of sacred things. And that's kind of what I was thinking about when I saw that reference to the pagan, festivals and stuff like that. And it made me think of what Chase was saying earlier about like that kind of collectivity where like people are coming together around this, and it's not necessarily for something like utility, but it does feel like he uses those words, orgiastic, generous, and excessive. On page 124 is where I see like y'all were mentioning like generosity and whatnot too, and it sounds like he's saying like this disappears when we see this shift.
Yeah, I think there's definitely so the notion of basically, like helping the poor is definitely not the main thing going on there. I think that would be just a kind of secondary effect, but really, okay, I think one way to approach this is about utility and useful. What exactly is that? Is similar to Schelling and how he talks about reason as having this, this ground of unreason. And I can never provide the ground of reason and found it on something that is just reason, again, this infinite regress. Ultimately, it's founded on this abyss. And I think the same thing about usefulness or utility. What is the utility of utility? Why be useful? Ultimately, even the kind of private accumulation idea, okay, I have tons of money, I've got all this power, what do I do now? I'm never just happy just sitting on my power or whatnot. You have to basically do something in order to really activate your power. And I think that's what he's getting at, that this is what is really important. So really what we want to do is something more like a game. We want to play more than just simply keep working to get advantage over another. What we really want is ecstasy, basically. We want ecstasy. We want these limit experiences, these extreme states. There's something more like that going on.
Is he saying that we achieve that through loss?
Yeah, I think so. So I think that's especially something that you see much more explicitly with something like these tribal societies that these anthropologists like Maus were studying. sorry, my cat's making noise, whatever. But you can see that too, even today. So then, okay, think about how much money goes into sports. What is the purpose of sports? You know, okay, of course there's people, you know, getting money off it, you know, the Glazers or the Cronkies, you know, yeah, people getting money, you know, the players, whatever, all this stuff, but ultimately it's dependent on these fans coming together and watching this, and it really doesn't have a purpose. There's just this excess of energy that needs to be expended. And I think the way you see that through all these different cultures, whether it's, you know, something like gambling or orgies or drinking or drugs or whatever it is, there's always something, there's always needs to be some kind of valve let off. And I think it's not really fundamentally different now, but what is different is that it's now kind of a secret thing that someone does, you know, outside of the gaze of the father who's watching us, saying, you know, I gave you all this shit, you know, how are you going to go and uselessly, you know, spend all this stuff on your stupid games? You know, why can't you just keep accumulating things? So the part where he talks about the father and the son, I think that's very good illustration of what he's talking about, in the sense of there's something different there, but at the same time, those underlying the real drives, I think, behind the economy, he's going to say is still the same, and it is this kind of limit experience where we, in some sense, are going beyond just a simple kind of equilibrium comfort state of ourselves. That's why we choose to gamble and risk all these things. So of course there's a lot of associations with like the death drive and whatnot, but I think there's something more like that underlies utility, and that is kind of what he's getting at, along with a whole bunch of this other stuff. So yeah.
I'm not sure how applicable this is. I've told this story many times, but I'm sure some of you guys get this too. But you know, I've told the story about my daughter studying fine arts, and people asking her, what good is that? And you know, that was not really what she had in mind. And you know, when I went to, I mean, whether it was good for something, and I'm sure you guys in philosophy majors get the same kind of stuff from people, you know, parents and other people, like you know, you go to some thing and, oh, hey Chase, haven't seen you in a whole lot. What you're doing what? Why would you do that? How are you going to make money doing that? So I don't know to what degree this is applicable, but at least that's one place where, yeah, I mean, frankly, it just frustrates me to no end that there are these pursuits that to me seem worthwhile, but when the only worth in a society is economic value, you know, what do you say?
I was reminded during this reading of Joseph Pieper, who was a German 20th century Catholic philosopher. He wrote a short book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, where he makes a distinguishing point between servile acts and liberal acts, right? Servile acts are just for the sake of another thing, while liberal acts are the love of the thing itself, period. And so ever since reading that back in the 8th grade, I've always thought of philosophy and these other subjects like art, which your daughter is getting at, as useless things when you're talking to somebody, because what they think by useful is something which produces something, namely, you know, money, right? Which then you'll use for other things. It goes on. But philosophy is useful because it's unuseful, in the sense that it's, when one reads philosophy and expands one's thoughts and challenges beliefs, ideas, from even the simplest things to the largest notions, you know, you aren't producing anything material, which we talked about earlier. I put Hunter to sleep. That's unfortunate. So yeah, philosophy is useless. That's the end. Just okay, one second. Just to go back to Bataille, his opening paragraph was all about when you argue about utility and usefulness, you're just mucking up waters, right? And it's just an ambiguous thing when you first talk to someone like Chase at this party or whatever 2 days ago. So you could sit them down and say philosophy is actually quite useful because bioethics and policy makers and framing of. I hate doing that though. I just like going for the fun answer of saying it's useless and then just looking them straight in the eyes and asking them about God.
I like that approach too, but I usually say Satan.
Yeah, I get that from my brother-in-law at sometimes. He's a doctor, and most of my wife's family are medical professionals or educators, and I've got to where it's just too exhausting to try to justify this life, and so I just settled on it being unjustifiable and just saying there's no justification. Why are you doing that? Because I want to. Why do you want to do that? I don't know. I just do. I mean, it's just one of the few things that gives me any sense of fulfillment in life. So that's what I'm going to do, but it's useless. Yeah. So.
Nevitt, what I do when someone kind of gets in my face like that too, it's like, oh, you've got the easiest job in the world. And I'll say, well, the way you're talking, that sounds like you're jealous. That you think I don't do any work, and yet look at the salary I'm making, and now you're wishing you had done it, but you haven't. Now you can't. So instead of lashing out at me, just deal with it yourself. And the second thing I'll say is, I get to read books and articles that interest me, and then to talk to people about those books and articles. Why wouldn't anybody want to spend their time doing that?
Because most people thinks it's frustrating and useless. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop.
I always, my first response is to, for years now, it's been, if somebody says like, why are you doing what you're doing? And I would say, oh, because I'm a selfish piece of shit, but let's put that aside for now. Why are you doing what you're doing? You're an engineer. What's that about? Why are you doing that? Oh, to get money. Why do you need that? What's up? Do you have some sort of problem? Do you need money? And oh no, yeah, I want to get lots of money. I want to be able to buy a nice house. Why do you need such a big house? Well, what's up? What's going on? What do you, and just whatever. I like a toddler. I'll just sit there until we start talking about something else, because they get bored and confused and forget what we were originally talking about, which is where most people are at in terms of because for us, I feel like the person who is in the line of work that is subject to such immediate, superficial sort of disregard, people generally will say wildly offensive shit, excuse my French, wildly offensive things to me and to people I know, and be like, yeah, that seems like a real waste of time. Oh, that, you just say wildly offensive things about my life and career and my source of meaning. And then if you say anything about it in a sincere way, their immediate response is always the same. In fact, actually, no, 95% of the time it's the same, which is this. Whoa, I didn't mean to you're taking it too seriously. Whoa, it's not this big. Hey, listen, buddy, I was just trying to be mean to you. I wasn't trying to hear a 6-hour dialogue about Epictetus or whatever. I'm not trying to, look, I get it. You probably have some sort of answer or whatever, and that's great. But I was really just trying to say something because I kind of wanted to be mean to you for a second, because I thought it would make me smile a little bit for a half a second. And I kind of wanted your attention. Because you're kind of interesting and different, and I don't really know how to broach that subject, because I feel like you're doing something that looks kind of fun and weird, and I never really did that. I chose to do things that my parents told me to do. Usually, that's most people that I interact with are just doing things. In fact, seriously, 80% of the people that I've ever asked, why are you doing what you're doing? They say, it's because I didn't know what else. I don't know. I was just doing this. I got high grades in biology in high school. Oh, okay. Why are you becoming a math major? Oh, because I got good grades in math. What else? What the fuck else am I gonna do? I don't know. Whatever. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about anything. is my basic assumption. Yes, a lot of people have no idea what to do. And then when you say that you have some idea as to what to do, I think they take offense. I think they're a little bit like, oh, fucking Mr. Logic Man thinks he knows all this hoo-ha about my brain and about the universe. Okay. I, on the other hand, have relegated myself to the position of drinking Natty Light and watching F1 every weekend if it can be helped. And I would much rather do that and get a wife who I'm barely attracted to and muddle through like 30 years of my life until I get pancreas cancer or something. I would much rather do that than to actually like sweat all the time. And it seems like you're doing that. And that kind of fucks with me. That kind of bothers me. It kind of pisses me off, you know? And I kind of wanted to come over and kind of express how pissed off I am at you a little bit. But I know that I can't really do that because you're kind of like a normal guy that people seem to trust. So I can't just come up to you and say, hey, fuck you. I can't just do that. So I have to instead say, hey, why are you doing this? It seems useless. And then suddenly the last 6 years of my life are framed for at least for one orgasmic moment. The last 6 years of my collegiate career are vindicated. In the school of mechanical engineering, suddenly all that doubt, all those years of sitting in my room thinking about how I should be doing anything else, how I wish I'd been a trombonist, all that time, it's all coming together into one singularity pointed directly at you and your life. And I am the laser cannon aimed to disintegrate you. And I have no real gusto to respond to that with. I can't be like, oh, you know, I feel that kind of energy coming towards me. And my immediate thing is to say, okay, it seems like there's a reason you're asking me why my immediate thought is, it seems there's a reason that this person is telling me that this is useless. Because I'm not just coming up to them and saying, oh, what are you doing? Oh, occupational therapy. Well, there are 6 million occupational therapists. What are you doing? Massaging old people until they fart? You know, that's awesome. How many more people do we need to do that? I don't do that. And I could do that if I wanted to be a jerk, but I don't do that. And I wonder why I don't do that. Maybe I should take a philosophy class to figure out why I don't do that. Why you shouldn't go up to people and tell them that their life is meaningless. Why? Maybe that's why I don't do that. You know, and maybe because they never did, they don't see any problem with coming up and harnessing all of the hatred, the measureless hatred that divides men, sharpening it into an axe and using it to split my head. Maybe that's why they have such a tendency to do that. But instead of just going on a little diatribe about people, I've had a little bit of, I've been drinking, by the way, it's not Pabst right now. I got a case of Blue Moon. Blue Moon's Belgian white ale. Very, very good. Very nice beer. Very big fan. But that's just to give you some sort of context. Here's my thing on Bataille. I wanted to just briefly kind of comment on a few things. Whoa, you're still sticking true to the PBR name. That's incredible. That's kind of nice. All right. I find that commendable, you know. But yeah, why are you drinking beer, Chase? Don't you see that that's useless? What's the point? You don't get any caloric energy out of it. And what? Do you get enjoyment? What's the point of enjoying? Fuck you. You know, I don't like the way that you do things. I don't like the way you are. So I'm just so
I just saw a cool commercial and I got the impression that I would be really cool if I drank it. So I don't think it worked, but I'm just gonna keep doing it because I feel like it. It gives my life meaning, definitely. Drinking a PBR, that's the orgasmic moment right there.
Speaking of beer, you talking about beer commercials made me realize a point I want to make about Bataille. There was an old, I think it was German beer ad. This is back to, okay, let's go back all the way to a few, okay. The very beginning of the paper, you know, he talks about this whole, okay, Nevin, you were talking about I think, why is it that there's some expenditure that's productive and some isn't, or how can this be expenditure if it's productive? I think that some expenditure is productive, I think that some expenditure is productive, but what we mean when we say productive, that's what he's trying to relativize, kind of productivity, utility, usefulness. He's trying to relativize that by saying like, look, why is it so impossible to imagine that society might have an interest in loss and cataclysm? Why is that so crazy? And then wouldn't it be that the loss in cataclysm is useful? Oh my God, you know what I mean? And in that sense, then, doesn't everything have some sort of use? I don't know, like even burning an animal, that turns that into smoke, which goes up into the atmosphere, which turns into stars, as far as I know. I don't know, maybe. So it makes me feel better. It kind of gets my brain flowing. It gets my creative juices flowing, and that's useful. I write really good poetry after I slaughter animals at the ritual sacrifice. That's useful. I don't know, whatever. I can do whatever and call it useful. Society can have a plethora of interests, right? But his main bent, I think his main like axe to grind at the beginning of this paper is to say, it seems like the notion of what makes humans humans, i.e. this homo faber sort of concept, which I do agree with, homo faber, the man, the thing that creates. I like that. But he's like, look, it just seems to exclude this non-productive expenditure, or what we would call non-productive. And that's, but then what do you mean non-productive? If you just said that all kinds of expenditure are in some sense constructive or productive, then what do you mean non-productive expenditure? And what I mean is that, yes, in a broad sense, any kind of expenditure can be seen as productive if we consider all sources, all senses of the meaning of cause and effect. If we take that as some sort of productive or constructive action, then yeah, everything's productive and constructive. Wow. But if we are aiming at a conception of expenditure that's not guided by the servile mode, and this is Nietzsche to a T, in my opinion. This is where he's like, at the very beginning, right off the bat, he's super Nietzschean. He's like, look, I'm just trying to kind of put forward this understanding of expenditure that's not dictated by the servile mode of us, the herd, the children, under the man, under the father, you know, the unified symbol of authority or whatever. So the point is, we go on, and I'm getting to a beer thing later in a second here, but this was something that was asked by Jackson a little bit ago. I'm experiencing allergies, and so I'm having to wipe my eye all the time. Oh, I got allergy medicine after that. Hold on. So Jackson was saying, in fact, actually, I'm going to find the post in the chat that got me thinking this, because it's important. He said, by putting pressure on one's, oh, yes. What is it? It was about Potlatch. It was about Potlatch and about the function of the Potlatch, wherein I sacrifice my goods. I have a loss in order to and then Jackson said, is this function by putting pressure on one's rivals? By putting pressure on one's rivals, you give them the chance to one up your Potlatch. Isn't that kind of a problem? Is that like by which is why we talk about the ideal. Is like the ideal would be if they couldn't respond at all, and they were so utterly subsumed and humiliated by your act of potlatchery that they just are totally defeated. They're just totally, utterly, that I agree. And Nevitt, you were pointing that out. I agree with that. That seems like that's what I thought of when he said the ideal. That's what I thought. So yes, but then that's the thing. That doesn't happen. And what instead happens is that by putting pressure on one's rival, you give them the chance to one up your potlatch. And there's this, and I said that is part of the disjunction in giving and receiving and losing and gaining, because to lose, you have to actually lose something. And to lose something for the sake of this sort of potlatchery or whatever, potlatchism, it's not that much of a loss if you can actually just sustain it. If you're chill, if you're good, if you can just do this all day, then that's not really a loss anymore. I mean, you're not losing much. At the very least, maybe it's a loss, but it's a very inconsequential loss. It's like if Jeff Bezos donates $2 billion to some fuck off charity. And I say, wow, that's incredible. $2 billion, I could never do that. But then somebody says, actually, compared to your salary, that's about $4. I would say, oh my God, that guy needs to donate a little bit. If he's got, come on. I'd be a little bit like, what the hell? What's this about? but so it has to be a loss. There's this, and this is what I was getting at when I said it's similar to Freud's old remarks on why a sadist and a masochist could never be in a functional relationship with each other. And this, I think, is, to me, this was the thing pulsating through the entirety of this text, was this asymmetry. This asymmetry in what Lacan would call jouissance, but we don't need to get into that. Okay, imagine a sadist and a masochist. One guy's like, I love to cause pain. The masochist is, I love to experience pain. Ooh wee mama. All right. well, then wouldn't Bertrand Russell would say, you two need to get together because you would be ideal for each other. I think Georges Bataille and Jacques Lacan would say, you should never, ever get together. That is a horrible idea. And they would say, but why? I'm a sadist. He's a masochist. I'm the peanut butter to his jelly, the chocolate to the peanut butter. You know what I'm saying? It's a beautiful little combo. And then what happens is the old joke. The masochist says, this is an old joke. That's literally, I have a book that has this in it. It says, masochist goes, oh, whip me, hurt me, please, anything, just hurt me. And then the sadist with a wry and mischievous smile starting to curl around his lips says, no, I don't think I will. And then the entire thing collapses, right? The dynamic between if a true sadist and a true masochist were to get together, it would just collapse instantly. It would just totally, because what do you suppose? No, I don't want to give you pain. Fuck you. All you're going to do is get off on that. That's stupid, you know?
Stop the masochist from doubling down on that and saying, oh, deny me pain some more. Deny me more pain. Like
then the sadist is caught in a dilemma where he says, well, I can't cause any pain. Oh, I'm just impotent. I can't cause any pain. I try whipping and he smiles, and then I don't whip and he smiles. And then he has a psychotic breakdown where his sense of ego identity is utterly fractured by his relation and dependence on another who he saw as servile to himself in one sense or another. This total, his anal oral drive is all turned upside down. He can't make his ass from his elbow. He's just totally, oh my God. And so this points to a beer commercial. This reminds me of a beer commercial. So I don't remember if it was Danish or German or Dutch or what, but it's a European beer commercial where this beautiful princess is by a creek and she sees a frog. And she picks up the frog and she gives it a little kiss. And then the frog turns into a beautiful Prince Charming, a big, handsome, jacked, like shirtless guy. He's like this huge, jacked ass dude. And she's like, oh my God, my Prince Charming. And then he grabs her, holds her lovingly, kisses her, and then she turns into a bottle of beer and then he drinks her. And the idea is, oh, you kiss somebody and then they turn into your fantasy. Oh my God. And that's so fun. I love that. But the more disturbing image, right, is shouldn't the ideal couple then, if we were to really think about it, the ideal couple would be a bottle of beer sitting next to a frog. And that doesn't make any sense. Nobody wins in that regard. The ideal coupling is a total absolute just discord between these two elements, radically pushing towards their discordant ends, begging the other one to become a bottle of beer. And questioning, why did you turn me into a person? God, I want to be a frog. Jesus, the last thing I want to be is a person. I was a frog seconds ago. That was so much better, you know, or oh, I just so desperately want you to be a beautiful man. I want you to be a beautiful, jacked, 6 foot tall man. And he says, okay, well, that's great, but only if I can have my fantasy, which is you as a bottle of beer. And this system of that's okay. To make this kind of make more sense to me personally, it's what Lacan calls the asymmetry of enjoyment. There's a confusion, or maybe not a confusion, but a potential source of confusion in the mechanisms of enjoyment, which is a big focus of Bataille here as one of the primary modes of productivity, is the enjoyment of people, the sustaining of a way of life, the sustaining of a mode of enjoyment, or the regulation of enjoyment. And he talks long and hard about what supplancy, there's a word in here that's about the illegality of radical luxuriating. There's some word he keeps using. It's not quite supple. It's something quite like supple, but he keeps using this word about like that. That's just the definition of the word. I looked it up the other night when I was reading. It was like, it is a legal code oriented around the restriction of pleasure or luxuriating. And he talks about that a lot as part of this sort of mechanism of expenditure, where expenditure itself is this luxuriating, you know, in this way. But I think that he points to something here that's interesting. And I think that what's also interesting is that we have different conceptions as to what he's pointing to here. I'm not reading chat right now, so maybe I should. Sumptuary. Thank you. Sumptuary. But I remember why I thought supple. It was because it was similar to sumptuous. And as sumptuary, I thought, as soon as I saw sumptuary, I thought of sumptuous, you know what I mean? And then I realized that was totally wrong. Well, I mean, it's kind of close, but my point is, my last thing I want to say is about Christianity. And it's that I see him as not totally condemning Christianity. I see him as definitely harshly critiquing Christianity and the mode in which it has exercised itself over time. I think he's very, very harshly critical of Christianity. Don't get me wrong at all, please. I am very harshly critical of Christianity. And yet, again, I am willing to call myself a Christian. I don't think Bataille would at all, but I think that he's very critical of Christianity. I'm just saying, I don't think he is absolutely condemning it in total. And I don't think anybody here is saying that he is. I don't think anybody here has put forward that idea. But just in case we were getting kind of suspicious of that, I'm just putting that forward. I think to get onto his notion of Christianity, to kind of keep going with this idea of this asymmetrical union, frog and beer bottle, sadist, masochist, giver and receiver, gainer and loser, this investigation of Christianity that he gives is very interesting, because he says, okay, well, that you have the poor. The way I read the Christianity section is like this. He's basically saying, like, you have the poor who challenge the rich in a state of exasperation and depression and exhaustion, because I'm a poor person. And as a poor person, I don't really have all the time and the luxury to amass legal counsels and to have like ethics summits and figure out fancy words for arguing as to why it's okay to maintain poverty. I can't really figure out why it's okay for poverty to exist. All I know is that it sucks and I hate it and I hate you. Mr. Rich Man who tells me that poverty is actually ethically okay or whatever. I am exhausted and I'm poor and you are fresh as a daisy and rich as can be. And I have no choice. Maybe not no choice, but one of my most powerful options is to engage in a display of literal refuse and moral indignation and moral condemnation, where you have people in the lower class basically saying, look, I don't care. Maybe I am what all the rich people call me. This is kind of the sense of that I got from Brothers Karamazov. I don't know how many people here have read Brothers Karamazov, but there's a key character named Fyodor. Great. Okay. Nevitt at least. And Ed, I think. Okay, great, Ed Jackson. So in the book, you remember Fyodor has this conversation with his son, and it's okay. The main character has a drunk dad, and his dad's named Fyodor. And so he goes to his one of the main characters. There's three brothers, but whatever. They have a dad named four brothers, and they have a dad named Fyodor. I'm trying to get to a point. And they have a dad named Fyodor. Fyodor's a big town drunk. And I think it's Ivan who goes up to his dad and says, why are you such a drunk, Dad? And his dad says, everybody thinks I'm a drunk. So whatever. I guess I am. I don't know. What's the point? Even if I were to go out all day and put on my clean little clothes and button up my stupid little shirt and make my stupid little money and be nice to everybody, I feel like everybody would still treat me like a total jerk. So whatever. I'm just going to be a jerk. I don't care. And maybe it was Australian, that beer commercial with the frog. But so he's like, I don't care. I'm just going to do this. And so you have poor people in a similar position saying, look, to the rich and to the wealthy, yeah, I'm kind of a disgusting, nasty, gnarly little goblin. And whose fault is that? And so this experience of despair is expressed in the individual, and it can be cultivated. It can be kind of laser focused into this sort of revolutionary aspect, into this sense of just righteous indignation, into this feeling of what he calls or religious despair, right? So there's this religious despair. We say, oh, I am but a servile little piggy, and it befits me so well as a servant of Christ to be given this life as a serf, digging up potatoes for my Lord, because that's just what I deserve. And this is the challenge that God gave me. And you hear this in Japanese folklore as well. I've heard this phrase so many times in Japanese. I have a book on Japanese mythology that I read on an airplane recently. I literally heard this phrase like 4 separate times, where a poor little old woman or something would be talking to somebody else, and she'd be or he or she or whomever would be talking about a really tough time in their life, like a really, really messed up period of their life. And they would say, you know how they would phrase it? I was given many opportunities to overcome difficulty. I was given a beautiful cornucopia of opportunities to transcend difficulty. I've had nothing but a wealth of opportunity to experience, to learn from, and to overcome my share of difficulties, which is a polite way of saying everything sucks and I hate this. and I am in suffering and I'm in constant difficulty. Or better yet, it's more of a, you know, sort of like a coping thing, I guess you could say, or maybe it's a real sort of coming to like, oh no, I really do feel the value in the fact that I've overcome these difficulties. Maybe it is that. Sorry, I'm fiddling with my mic also. But so you have this religious despair, right? With these people who say, I am a serf, I'm a servant of God, I had many experiences or opportunities to overcome difficulty, I am a pig, I am disgusting, whatever, rightfully so, for whatever reason, this religious sort of despair, which he then says is easily exploited by a system or structure of power. And this Nevitt is owing to what you're saying as to the whole power thing coming back again, is because he'll paint these elegant pictures of social dilemmas, and then he'll say, but in the end, it's just all kind of funneled back into this system of the maintaining of power. Let's not have any illusions. A lot of what's going on here is redirected. A lot of this energy is being redirected, kind of laser focused into these proper channels that are like very effective for the maintaining of power and the exploitation of that energy. No, I have not listened to Joel Osteen. I don't see why I would, but maybe okay, maybe he's good. I don't know. But the thing is, so Christianity, he says, okay, so Christianity as a religion, we talk about this religious despair, right? Where everybody that's religious is thinking, you know, either I am a filthy little thing and God has cursed me, or I'm sad and pathetic, and that is just as God made me in his image, and I love him for that, or whatever. It's just this despair, this coming to terms with your situation through this religious lens that justifies it. And this is Nevitt, you talked about why this, and this I think is Bataille agreeing with you in a critique on William Jameson. Right? Is it William James? William James. On his dog. Oh, if the dog knew how cool it was when we cut him open, he would be just fine with that. He would be really excited actually to participate in the grand scheme of things. And you said, I don't think he would. I wouldn't. And he's saying here that, like, yes, that is the case. That if we often use this sort of religious despair as this grander scheme that kind of justifies our suffering. But then he says, okay, well then what can we say about it in real life, rather than just kind of our conceptions of it? Well, he says Christianity, in a sense, stands as a sort of celebration, a very weird kind of like psychosexual celebration of disease and torture and failure and despair. The meek will inherit the earth. Let's all get together and put our mouths on the same cup and sit in a small dark room together, you know what I mean, with a very old geriatric man reading a sermon to us who's ready to die by any infectious disease, you know. So it stands not just for this celebration of torture and despair, right, but in celebrating that torture and despair and the finitude and the lack and my servility and whatever, it becomes a stand-in for a real social force. And what he calls that real social force is the oppositional principle between contrasting parties. The oppositional principle between any contrasting parties at all. Any contrasting party. This is where he talks about Christ coming down and saying, I came to divide, not to unite. I came with a sword. I will set mother at variance with daughter and father at variance with son. You know what I mean? And he says, okay, so Christianity in a sense stands for this oppositional principle, right? Okay. So that, at the very least, is not necessarily a totally condemnable aspect of Christianity. And he says, okay, so we've got this sort of weird, the problem with this standing for oppositional principle is that it just gets funneled back into the self-reproduction of systems of power that we already deal with, right? It's exploited. It's very easily exploited. That's the problem. You know, that's a big problem with it, at least. But then he says, okay, well, let's kind of move on from that. Let's just say, yes, it's very easily exploited, but there is this sort of standing of an oppositional party, standing for the oppositional principle. And yes, there is this standing for the oppositional principle, but it is easily exploited. Well, okay, we seem to be in something of a conundrum. Let's try to move forward, right? Well, let's talk about Christian humility and Christian humiliation in the face of this. Like, what if I were talking to a Christian right now and I said, you know, do you stand for all the voices of despair screaming in the riot of the great dark night of the world? And they would say, well, I mean, I think Christ stands with them in the sense that he suffers with them and his heart bleeds for them, and he seeks what is best for his flock. Absolutely, you know. But do I stand in support of that voice as it is? Nay, I say. I don't know the will of God. It is, and in fact, I recently read an article by a Vietnam veteran who talked to a bishop while he was in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese or not, the bishop said, "Look, it's not my place to judge men. I'm serious." And he's stuck by that the whole conversation through. He kept saying, like, "What do you think of this guy? What do you think of this guy?" And he says, "I'm not. This is not just a rhetorical thing. I don't feel appropriate in judging men. I can't get that across any clearer." And as a part of that, I'm here in Vietnam, dude. Like I'm not exactly thinking about like if that guy was kind of a jerk to me the other day. I'm not really in the business of judging men. I have to think somewhere else, you know? And that's a state of something like Christian humility, right? Which of course, if we talk about that sort of asymmetry that's caused in the one that's benevolent and the one receiving the benevolence, you know, there's this sort of asymmetry to where this Christian humility of, oh, I'm not in the place to judge men, that actually kind of comes around and turns into a sense of conceit, wherein I know well enough not to judge men. That's another way to word that, is I'm smart enough not to try and judge men. That's God's business. That's another way to word, I'm not in the position to judge men. You know what I mean? I happen to know better. You know what I mean? Is a kind of way. So it's a humility in a sort of, you know, circular, almost conceited way. But this Christian humility that says it's part of a process of social opposition and development. And he words it like this. This is where I think his condemnation of Christianity comes forward, right? Maybe not condemnation. Yes, I'm way better than the majority of these sinners. Yes, I agree. Don't worry. I know what's up a little bit. But Bataille says the thing about this Christian humility is that it turns into this state like a drunkenness, this sort of drunken like stupor that you get into before this, like in the face of this unceasing splitting. He called it this ceaseless splitting, this measureless hatred, this endless torment, right? And so this drunkenness in the face of torment and splitting, right? It batters the soul of the Christian humiliated subject. The humiliated Christian is surrounded by destruction and torment and death and so on, right? And he says, okay, well, this is evident in, I brought this movie up before, but Shooting Dogs, where the guy is in the Rwandan genocide, surrounded by like in a school building full of young children who are, I think, who is it that genocided who? Was the Tutsis that genocided the Hutu, I think. It was the Tutsis, I think, that genocided the Hutu, I think. I'm pretty sure. But whichever one, let's just say that it's that. There are Hutu survivors in a school building and two white people in the whole building. And one of them is Hugh Dancy from hit television series Hannibal as Detective Will Graham. And then some other guy whose name I forget. But Will Graham, basically, Hugh Dancy, his character, they're in a building surrounded by Tutsis about to bust in and shoot everybody and kill them all. And Hugh Dancy's kind of freaking out, and all these kids are kind of freaking out, about to get killed. And Hugh Dancy turns to this other white guy, this missionary, and says, "Hey, you know how you guys, you Christian types, are always talking about God's always with us? What's that about? Why do you say that? Because it doesn't really feel like it right now. Actually, I feel kind of horrible. I don't know if this is kind of making me feel like the love of God and all that. Is God really with us right now?" And then the guy says, "I see what you're saying. I get it. But yes, still, I know, but yes, he is." And he says, "Well, how could you mean that?" And he said, "Well, you see, Hutu genocided the Tutsi." Okay, sorry. No offense to any Hutu or Tutsi listeners out there. I merely had a moment of inaccuracy. So he says, "Oh yeah, Christ is right here with us." And he says, "How so?" And he says, "He's suffering right here with us all the time." And then right there, the movie ends. As you hear like a battering ram hitting a door. And it's awesome. It's a really cool way to end a movie, but it gets across a pretty important point, right? And it's relevant here in this position of the humiliated Christian, surrounded by torment and splitting and hatred that divides men between Hutus and Tutsis in a disparaged and impoverished locale surrounded by impoverished persons, given an unfair and unjust life and existence compared to what, exists otherwise. There's this, in the face of this, I mean, for that Christian missionary, the only choice he had to do was kind of pray to God and then get shot to death and die. And that sucks. But Bataille is saying, okay, let's kind of go. And that's the thing, is that it kind of, he says a big problem with Christianity is that it urges this atomization and this individuality, this atomizing, where it's just about you and your relationship to God. And you don't really need to think too much about, the rest of that. It's where Jordan Peterson gets off being all thinking that he's like not thinking, but calling himself such a sort of staunch Christian. You know what I mean? Is in the effort of supporting this individualistic strain of Christianity, which I have opinions on, but I'll save that. So Bataille says, okay, well, it seems then that only revolution is able to promise to plunge the noble or ignoble classes, the wealthy and powerful classes, into, and he calls it capital G, capital N, the great night, where the poetry is where all the wealthier classes' poetry is drowned out by the screams of rioting. And that's, first off, that's awesome. But he's trying, I think that the point is that, be it a Christian revolution or a workers' revolution, a Protestant revolution or a proletariat revolution. And he sees the two as very similar events, I think. He makes parallels to the two, the Christian Protestant revolution and the worker revolution, and like the revolution of Christianity, even out of sort of, the Abrahamic origin that it had amidst Roman Empire. He saw that as sort of this revolutionary impulse. It's very interesting, you know what I mean? This revolution promises something outside of the typical operations of power, which totally negate or ignore poverty as a position of power at all. Poverty has no social sway for him, for Bataille. I mean, he's not saying that poverty's, stupid or negligible. He's saying that within the social sphere, poverty is given no credit or time. It doesn't, because it was specifically intentionally engineered to do that, so that poverty would hold no weight at all. And the only thing that would hold any social efficacy was wealth and the expenditure of wealth in its own sort of constant self-reproducing and expending. And so this great night of revolution is the only thing that promises to plunge these haughty, uptight, aristocratic classes down into the great night, which we will pull them down, as the proletariats, of course, we will pull them down into this place. And then all their fancy little ethical words will be drowned out by the screams of a riot, and then there will at least be a little bit of moving and shaking, a little bit of, and he's not saying, yes, this is what we should do. We need to pull the upper classes into a riot and kill them. He is not saying that, but I think he's pointing to the reason that a revolution, or the promises of revolution, holds so much attraction. In fact, he compares the level of attraction to the attraction that the sun has to primary organisms like grass. And it's like, there's a huge attracting principle here. And this all circles back to what Nevitt was saying, which is that this is very largely framed on Nietzschean grounds. In the sense that they are attracted to this well. I would call it a well, like a gravity well in space, a well of power. You know what I mean? This promise, this potential energy stored up in a class of billions, 4 billion, 5 billion, 6.8 billion people against 0.2 billion. I think we would win. And something about that thought gives me a little bit of makes my heart skip a beat a little bit. Makes me think, ooh, it's what I forget. Bill Haywood. Bill Haywood was an American 1920s labor organizer and IWW sympathizer who had a famous quote, and he said, "The working man holds all the cards. Should we come together and put our hands in our pockets for just a second, all at the same time, we would have the world in our grasp. We would be totally in control if we all put our hands in our pockets." And I get that it's a simple thing and it's not really true, but it's pointing to a very important thing, which is this drive toward the power that's promised, the untapped wealth of power, hidden, dormant in the belly of this proletariat body. And I think that Bataille here is trying to say, yes, there is value in these aspects of revolution, and there's value in these struggles for rights and freedoms, and sure, you know, there's something beautiful and irreplaceable in this celebration of torture and despair, this weird kind of erotic, sexual, tense space of being a Christian. And he's like, and he's thinking about things like, why do so many pornography photos back in the 1930s, you could look at porn for like a penny in a little view box, and this little viewing box would have like black and white slide photos. And I know this is weird, but I've seen vintage pornography in the 1920s and 30s, and it's wild. And a lot of it is like classy, upper class, like well-to-do ladies kind of lifting up their skirts and stuff like that, and nuns and stuff spanking each other with rulers and bullshit, stupid bullshit that is like so, like, you know, it's campy to us, but there really is a reason that it was that. There's a reason that was so popular, you know, and it's this thing that isn't just purely disgusting. I think the last thing Bataille would say is that Christianity is just a breeding den for disgusting, you know, overly sexual habits. Ugh. I don't think he's like a moral conservative in that regard, you know. So even the sort of filthy, sort of disease-ridden aspects of Christianity, I don't think he's pointing to them as filthy or disease-ridden in the effort of totally condemning it. I think that he's pointing to the filthy and disease-ridden aspects of Christianity in a sort of inversion. Yeah, this story, yeah, in like the story of the eye, in this sort of, hello kitty, in this sort of inverted way, where Christianity stands for this union of all men as children of Christ, right? But at the same time stands as this celebration of torture and opposition and conflict. And the reason that it seems so interesting, or a big reason that it seems so interesting, is it promises this power. And this is deferring to Nietzsche. This is kind of borrowing from Nietzsche. He says Christianity gets the weak into this mindset where they have power too. They can have some power, like saying, I can put up with an entire lifetime of being tortured because I will have infinite power in heaven. You know what I mean? When I get to the kingdom of heaven, I will have infinite pleasure rather than this infinite pain that I have in life. I think Bataille is just pointing to this like this basis of Christianity as being this weird conquest for power and like sexual pleasure and of like self-gratification. And he's pointed to these really, really, really crazy aspects of this approach to Christianity, but at the same time, and to the allure, to the, like, you know, people can be drawn into this. And then further saying, not only is it that easy to get drawn into Christianity, but it's also extremely easy for it to be exploited. It's extremely easy for this whole thing to be exploited by an existing structure of power. And so I think that ultimately, he's not totally condemning Christianity itself, but I think that he is saying that Christianity, I don't know what his stance on Christianity is personally, but he is in no way totally condemning it, nor assenting to it as a sort of vehicle for progress or revolution. And I think he's saying, if people tell you that Christianity is kind of this vehicle for progress or revolution, you should be wary, because that comes with weird implications about what they're seeking and why, and to the degree to which they just want power in this Christian meekness, you know? And so he's pointing to the dangers of Christianity, but not necessarily condemning it or assenting to it, which is in contrast to other thinkers like Zizek and G.K. Chesterton, who say that Christianity is really dope. They say Christianity is the vehicle of revolution and of self, or abjection of the self, to the point of total subjective destitution. Zizek says that subjective destitution is available to us pretty much entirely through the lens of a Christian mindset and a Protestant sense of freedom. So there really are compelling, interesting Christian voices in favor of this sort of radical freedom offered by Christianity. But I think that Bataille is just saying here, like, look, maybe the mythos has some sort of poetic value or whatever, but dude, it's like this. If we want to talk about brass tacks, look at the Catholic Church, look at the Protestant Reformation, look at the Puritans, dude, look at slavery, look at all these things that have happened, you know? And yes, there are beautiful aspects of it, but yeah, wars of religion. Look at all this. How could you, you know? And yes, again, maybe the poetry's cool, but isn't the whole point of the poetry to pull other people into some great night where poetry is drowned out? Isn't that the whole idea? You know, and he's so it seems like, and I think his whole point is like, it's not necessarily that all Christians are evil or stupid, but that if you hear a Christian argument, you should try and understand kind of why they're saying what they're saying, and try to develop a more sort of thoroughgoing and maybe even sympathetic understanding of what they're aiming at and why. Because it's not necessarily coming from a place of avarice and greed, maybe, but maybe it's just coming from a place of exasperation and desperation and humiliation as a Christian, as this subject that's humiliated and degraded and subjugated, you know, and as a participant in this human life that, according to him, is not and cannot be thought of as a closed system in any regard, you know, which is why also I agree with you, Chase, that it seems like he ultimately comes to something of a position similar to Nietzsche and Marquis de Sade, which would include Christianity as something of a closed system approach to humanity, somewhat of a closed system approach, which is just, especially like Gnosticism and stuff like that. I think he'd be like, that's just weird. I don't know. That maybe, I don't know actually what Bataille would think about Gnosticism. Maybe he would think it's you know, some sort of weird like cosmological end result of bourgeois decadence. I don't know.
He has some kind of essay on Gnosticism, I think, in the Notion of Excess. I haven't read it, but yeah.
I disagree with Zizek and Chesterton. It isn't Christianity that's going to be the vehicle for the revolution. That's obvious. It's going to be for Zoroastrianism. Anyone who's even taken a moment knows what I'm talking about. You know, let's go Team Ahura Mazda.
Someone said, I can't remember if there's something Chase or Hunter said, but it spurred this thought as to why, you know, why we're so obsessed with production and conservation, why we're so hung up on things being progressive and useful and so on. And I don't know what the origins of that are. I mean, you know, people pointed to Protestantism and things of that sort, but you know, I heard somewhere, I can't remember who told me this or who I heard say this, but someone was speculating that scientific theories even are, and maybe I'm thinking of Kuhn or somebody, but scientific theories are influenced by social, well, maybe I'm thinking of Nietzsche because he would say this, but scientific theories are influenced by social forces. And, you know, I'm thinking that John Stuart Mill and Darwin were contemporaries. They lived, their birth and death were separated only by a few years. And Origin of the Species was published 2 years before the second edition of Utilitarianism. And, you know, so when you start talking about whether things are useful or not and whether they need to be useful, you know, if you think about the theory of evolution and its contemporary scientific interpretation, you know, what evolution does, I mean, it's hard to talk about it without sounding teleological, but hopefully you guys all understand that natural selection, the way it works, it's supposed to be not teleological, but the effect is that it produces organisms that survive and propagate. That's basically the whole thing. You know, genes develop so that they produce more genes of the same type. And so they just, you know, like as Dawkins said, we are gene machines and our purpose, quote, biologically speaking, is just to produce more genes. And there's sort of a utilitarian air already to that, you know, so there's this sort of, well, you know, well, to be useful, you have to reproduce. And evolution is useful because, or it's you know, it's a utilitarian kind of mechanism because it produces, you know, it produces genes, it produces copies of the species. And so, because part of what I was wondering is why is it that we have such a fixation about being productive? Like I don't remember where it is, but when he talks about where the bourgeois, the thing they really hate is expenditure. They want everything to be useful, and and so even if when they're throwing their excess for the purpose of bread and circuses, it's for the purpose of placating the proletariat, which is useful to them as well. And so why are we so fixated? Well, part of it maybe is just accidents of social and political and economic history, Protestantism, Puritanism, which probably was partially the reason we ended up with capitalism and all that. But it seems like it's infected. Well, I don't know. I mean, it makes me wonder if that way of thinking has infected everything so much that it's also infected scientific theory. Now, I believe in evolution. I mean, it seems like a reasonable theory, but there is this sort of economic productivity feature of the theory of evolution. And I don't know, it just makes me wonder, like Bataille, maybe part of what he's doing is pointing at these presuppositions that we have, namely everything has to be productive and everything has to be, either productive or conservative. And then if you ask why, well, that's kind of a stupid question, isn't it? Like, why? But maybe it's not a stupid question. And, so maybe, I don't know near enough about Deleuze to speculate, but I wonder if maybe there are philosophers who might say that you can interpret evolutionary forces in terms of, for example, of expenditure, like throwing out all kinds of shit and just seeing what sticks, and sort of reorienting our frames of reference. And so I don't know, I'm just thinking that maybe part of what, and I don't know, this is the only thing I've ever read by Bataille, but I'm wondering if he would say that there is this whole frame of mind that we have that, of course, production and conservation are the ultimate values, of course, and that that ends up driving just scientific speculation, economic speculation, social, theory, and the whole thing.
I think this is kind of the thing that I guess the thing that I'm contending with and that I'm interested in, the thing that motivates my interest in continuing to look into Bataille. And it's that, like you said, about this sort of evolutionary thing. It's like and then Chase made a point about what Bergson, it's actually just on a weird moment of happenstance. Joey posted, "What does Bergson say?" And then Chase just happened to have like typed out everything about what Bergson says and just like instantly. And I was like, oh, so and I agree with Chase's notion in the chat that Bergson says that evolution is creative but not necessarily bound to an external and determinate goal. I guess this is where I think Hegel is trying, in my brain, the Hegel inside of my skull is trying to kind of crack the egg and be like, oh, I'm here at the center. Please keep focusing on me. And is saying, yeah, I see what the little Hegel is saying. Oh yeah, I see what Bataille is saying. It's that he's trying to illustrate a sort of a conception of necessarily unnecessary aspects to a thing. You know what I mean? Like, and a way that Hegel might kind of put this, it's kind of similar to the idea of like, there are certain aspects of an event for Hegel that you would call possibilities, lines of flight in Deleuzian terms, these potentialities, these virtual counterfactual aspects of what's going on, or potentials, you know what I mean, whatever. All those sorts of aspects to a thing, an event, a thing, a presence, a being, a whatever, And that comes with these things that we would call possibilities, you know what I mean? And Hegel would say, yes, they are merely possibilities, but it is absolutely necessary that they maintain themselves merely as possibilities. It is totally necessary that those things never happen. You know what I mean? That they are merely possible. There's this sense by which I feel like Bataille is in a sense saying that like this, what we like, and that's what I think motivates for me, my basic first sentence understanding of Bataille's basic script, which is to say, there are seemingly unnecessary aspects of our mode of existence and of expenditure and reproduction, right? There are seemingly unnecessary aspects like war. What about back in Vietnam? You're writing songs about like, where have all the flowers gone and all that. It's like, oh, can't we just do without all the war? Please, you know, why can't we just have a perfectly good market economy without brutalizing people of color in the global South, or engaging in unjust murder campaigns overseas, or engaging in child sex slavery rings among the rich and famous? Why can't we do that? Why does it seem like every time we try to have a perfectly functional global market economy, there's all this sex trafficking and political sabotage and war and all this? It's just unnecessary. Come on, guys. You know, you might have like I don't want to say naive, but like a semi-naive liberal might say, come on, why can't we just get along without all this humdrum, all this unnecessary stuff added on top of our otherwise perfectly reasonable market economy? In what way does a market economy necessitate genocide? You know, what's wrong with this? You see what I'm saying? And then Bataille would say, yes, logically speaking, it is unnecessary, but at the same time, it is the case that unnecessary attaches to this system are in fact necessary, you know? And yeah, it's like you're saying, Chase, it's like for Hegel, like you're kind of pointing to like the temporal thing, yeah, which is a part of it, is like the contingent roll of the dice that becomes necessary upon coming into play. It was all always going to unfold the exact way that it did. Of course, how could we have thought otherwise? How could anybody have anticipated anything else? You know what I mean? It's just, yeah. But yeah, I see that as kind of what he's coming from when he's talking about the necessity of these things, and why I might say to somebody, if I was at a party and they said, hey, why do you do philosophy? Isn't that unnecessary? And then I'd say, well, funny you say that. It actually is unnecessary, but it's a necessary unnecessity. So that's good for me. I'm very lucky in that regard, that it's necessarily unnecessary, which is spectacular, you know, because, you know, I frankly don't see our system getting very far at all without, if all of the unnecessary aspects of experience were all vaporized in an instant and made illegal all at once, what would the world look like? You know what I mean? I doubt it would be a functional global like commerce system of commerce. I think it necessitates this luxuriating and this violence, you know, and that's just, to me, like his basic social critique, you know, which goes further into a sort of theoretical structural systemic thing. We need that expenditure, we need that, you know, excess, that waste, you know.
So one thing that kind of reminds me of is, so you're talking about that kind of collection of power, you know, that people are moved towards and whatnot. I think there could be something like that, but one of the points I think that Bataille would want to make is that in order to really access that power, it would in turn change the person who actually sought the power, and that there's certain structures of society will do that in different ways. So I think one of his critiques of modern society would be that it allows people to possess some kind of real social power while maintaining this kind of atomistic, individualistic kind of motive, but that we shouldn't necessarily take that as this universal, eternal principle of social organization. And instead, we should see that that is something that has developed, but it's from a genealogical perspective, there's a history to it, a history of its differentiation through time. And that this, vitalistic well of power and creativity that is also a kind of destruction, that can, something maybe that's amoral in a certain sense, that in order to be used under different structures of society, it therefore had to change how that person wanted to express it, or that it was even just a person, an individual using it, and not something that implies, it's the same way that, when we were talking about Oedipus Rex and what's the one before that? Sophocles.
Antigone?
Antigone, thank you. Yes. So Antigone, the same thing, why is she doing this? She's an individual, but then I think before you couldn't really separate yourself come up with that conception of yourself as an individual apart from some kind of a social structure that defined that individuality for you. You needed some kind of a background in order to get the total gestalt of the individual. So I think it's something similar to that, is a way of kind of seeing what he's talking about with this historical development. And I didn't totally get I think all of the Christianity and the class struggle aspect. I read it really late at night about a week ago, and then I've been in Houston for 5 days and just got back a few hours ago. I'm really tired, so it's not very fresh in my mind, but I remember that part seems interesting in terms of not only his critique of what is going on today, but also, some kind of revolutionary solution that in some sense sort of brings back this Dionysian aspect of expenditure that's really always been at play to a certain degree. What exactly his solution is, though, I'm not exactly sure, but be interesting to find out, I guess.
That, this part of what this makes me wonder, this Dionysian thing, giving more free play to expenditure and so on. Okay, sorry. But anyway, this excess is going to produce, I would think, lots of unpleasant consequences. Also, that's one reason I brought the notion of the Republican, is that in the Republic, when Socrates starts designing the ideal city, initially he designs the city that just satisfies basic human needs, and he likes that city. He says he really does believe that's the best human city. But Glaucon calls it a city fit for pigs because they're just eating, because it's a it's a vegetarian society, and they're just eating, vegetables and stuff. And he goes, well, God, that's what you feed pigs. And so Socrates says, oh, I see what you mean. We need to design a city with a fever. And then when he starts designing the city with the fever, you get jewelers and dancers and actors and prostitutes and jewelry. You get all these people. You get the arts. That's what you get, the arts, but you also get prostitution. And now they're eating meat. And he says, so you're going to need a whole lot more doctors. And so, I'm wondering if in Bataille's terms, this is the shift to allowing for expenditure, where people are now expending money on luxurious foods and on prostitution and so on. But then again, he says, But, well, two things happen. One, you need more doctors. And the other thing that happens is now that you're giving free rein to desires in excess of needs, once you start trying to satisfy people's desires, well, people's desires are never satisfied. You know, needs you can satisfy within a limited scope of resources. But once you start satisfying people's desires, you know, the way desires work, you satisfy these desires, but then you just want this, and you satisfy those desires, and then you want this. And so desires continue on without limit. And so then Socrates says, and this is where you get war. Because what will happen is, you know, maybe if you were satisfying just people's needs, you could satisfy their needs purely from the resources available to that community and available through free trade with other city-states. But once you start trying to satisfy people's desires, that's going to go on without limit. And so necessarily the city's desires will expand beyond the possible resources and fair trade. And so you're going to have to start taking other people's stuff if you're going to continue to satisfy desires. And every other city is going to be doing the same thing. And so eventually you're going to have war, and that's where you end up with, you know, the guardian class and that whole thing. And so interestingly, Socrates does not, I mean, he accepts that. And the Republic is the luxurious city. It is the city with the fever. The Republic is not the simple city. Once Glaucon Levy, you know, brings this criticism, Socrates completely abandons the simple city and says, you're right. Human beings are not going to be satisfied merely having their needs met, at least most human beings. So now we're going to have to start living this luxurious life of ever expanding desires, medical crises, military war, you know, the whole thing. And so I guess one of the things I wonder with, you know, if Bataille is saying that we need, I don't know if he is, but if he's saying we need to give more place to expenditure, does something like that happen? Yeah, do you end up with delirium and madness and so on? And is he saying, well, that's just the way it is, and so we ought to allow for that? Or I don't know what he's saying.
And you never will.
Yeah, I think he's saying that is always what's driving society, whatever society it is, and that yeah, you're always going to have some kind of expenditure, because I mean, if you think of it as something like a kind of systems theory kind of thing, where you necessarily, okay, for just an organism, you need first some kind of a barrier that is also porous enough to allow the outside world to kind of come in somewhat, so that this organism has some kind of a coupling to the environment, yet it can be distinguished from the environment. It has to be able to take in resources, but also the waste function. It has to be able to shit, basically. And just like, you know, you see that in cells, which is everything. If it's living, it's shitting, and otherwise they'll just build up. And I think that's similar to the death drive, or actually, you know, there's a lot of baggage with that. So I'll just say, you know, I think life is pretty intelligent in the sense of thinking of sexual reproduction and the way that we don't just have these people that live forever and just sit there in this kind of, you know, stratified way, just indefinitely. The fact that individuals die and are replaced by other ones, I think that's, and to see that how that aspect of death and renewal and whatnot is all kind of connected, that's probably what he would point at, something like that. That there's this necessity for that expenditure, and it's functional in every society as a condition of it simply being a society. Otherwise, it would probably go into some kind of self-destructive, malignant kind of bloating state, and then just, you know, explode into war anyways. There's just, it would immolate itself in something. And whether that's really just fundamentally different from another society in that aspect, I don't know. I think maybe he would say all societies ultimately are like that. Not exactly sure, but I think he's pointing at just that it would be helpful, at least, for envisioning some kind of different society, some kind of thinking otherwise, to be aware of that principle, especially because, you know, there's it's not something that doesn't function today, but it's simply something that is, I think, even, okay, you've got the bourgeoisie or whatnot, and they're obsessed with, you know, utility and functional whatever economic analysis of all these things, cost benefit analysis. But notice they're not themselves applying that just for themselves. They're giving it as an imperative, usually on other people. Ultimately, that's got to be a pretty neurotic person if they live by that to like on like a, you know, like a religious decree kind of level, where they, I mean, does anybody know someone who just operates as purely on cost benefit analysis calculations and just never takes a moment to just let loose in some way that isn't thinking of like, what can I do to benefit my economic standing or something like that? So I think there's something necessary about that. And I think he's just trying to get us to be aware of how that's used. And, you know, from a Nietzschean perspective, so one thing that's interesting is how he talks about the bourgeoisie. They formed in a kind of subservient position to the monarchy, and so they couldn't have that aspect of expenditure and public display that the monarchy was able to. So they kind of formed under this resentment. And I think you can see that there is something kind of like that in the fact that, okay, let's put all value in this thing that I have, which is, you know, quantities of capital or whatnot, and then make it where other people apply this to all society, that they need to have these things. And if they just simply follow these principles, you know, they could do it too. So yeah, I think the fact that they can't be consistent in that for themselves would be something he would point at. But yeah, I'm tired. What is it, 8:10? Oh. So let's read Bataille. Yeah.
So I'm gonna send out a link to a poll, and the poll is going to have 3 choices: read Heidegger, read Bataille, vote on something from that list of other choices that we've got. So I'll be sending that out, and we thought it'd be nice at least some of us had an opportunity to look at Bataille before we made that decision. So I'll be sending that out soon. Any last comments before we let Chase take a nap?
So the main point of this short paper was that we should all go gamble on horses. I remember that section. Thank you. Okay, I'm gone.
Bye.
All right, bye.